in the days of empire, the British started to grow concerned about the number of cobras in India. So the governors came up with a simple economic remedy. Why don't we just offer a bounty, offer a payment for cobra hides? And that policy was a hit. In fact, so successful was it that enterprising Indians started to breed cobras just to get the bounty. Now, unsurprisingly, that caused a suspicious increase in the number of bounties paid out, and eventually the British clocked on. They realized what was happening and sold the scheme. But this posed a problem for the breeders. They now had all of these worthless snakes. What are they going to do with them? Well, they chose to loose those surplus serpents back into the wild, which caused the cobra population to surge past its previous levels, and of course completely defeated the point of the scheme. Almost every action we take introduces the risk of unintended consequences. Technology, of course, is no different. The cultural theorist Paul Virilio knew this well, writing these famous words. When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technical progress. And oh boy, over the last few years have we discovered these negativities. We've served up countless examples of technology gone wrong. The press is now as likely to call technology a danger to the world as much as it is to call it a savior. Now, to be clear, these mistakes, awful as they are, they weren't intentional. They're really the result of these unintended consequences. There wasn't really any malice involved, but there was plenty of negligence. We should still take some of the blame for these unfortunate headlines. And unless this changes, I think this is going to hamper the growth of our industry. Because over the next 10 to 20 years, the tech community is going to ask an enormous amount of trust from our users. We will ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. We'll ask them to trust us with their homes, their vehicles, even the safety of their families. And the potential harms that come with new technologies, with emerging technologies, are even higher than the risks in technology today. The stakes will only get higher with time. Algorithms could reinforce and cement bias in access to work, amenities, even justice. Surveillance systems could silently assemble the building blocks of totalitarianism. Automation could transform and ravage the world of work. It could deepen inequality and upend our economies. So I think it's time that our industry started taking its ethical responsibilities seriously. And so this has been my focus now for the last 3 or 4 years. So I'd like to talk today about what I've learned along that journey and give some thoughts on how we as a community of designers and technologists, how we can respond to these kinds of challenges. Perhaps the first and most fundamental change that we need to make is in our mindset. We have to recognize that technology is not neutral and that it never was. Back in 1980, the philosopher Langdon Winner wrote an essay that's now rather well known called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And his conclusion essentially was, yeah, damn right they do. And Winner gave the example of Robert Moses. Robert Moses, some of you may have heard of, was essentially the chief city planner of New York early in the last century. And Robert Moses was a racist. We know this. We have ample evidence of his bigotry, of his prejudiced views. And Winner goes on to claim that Moses actually asserted his bigotry through design. So we see here a bridge built over a parkway leading from New York down to the beaches of Long Island. And you'll notice on the right-hand side there is just a 9-foot clearance. It's a very low bridge. Winner claims this was intentional. The purpose of this low bridge was essentially to racially segregate the city. The point of this bridge being that it was so low that buses couldn't pass underneath it. And at that time, the residents of New York City and the New York area particularly minority residents and black residents, tended not to have access to private transport. They had to travel mostly by bus. And because these bridges were built so low that a bus couldn't pass underneath them, essentially meant that minorities could not access these beaches in Long Island. So even this inert structure, this hulking mass of, dozens of tons of stone and concrete and steel, even this bridge had a moral and a political and a social impact. So of course the technologies that we build today, full of light and language and energy, of course they can have just as large impacts. And that makes sense really, because the world of technology is also the world of humans. It's a mistake to separate what technologies can do from what people can do. These things act together. We become these interwoven hybrid actors. Moses' racist bridges show that things change what people can do and how they do it. So we have to abandon this belief that the things we build are neutral tools. We can't wash our hands of the social and ethical and political consequences of our work. Now, to some people, that can be kind of a tough sell, because technologies, algorithms, data, we see these things as clean and objective. Maybe the most enduring ideology we have in this industry is that technology has no ideology. But of course, we know that that's not really the case. Professor Jeffrey Bowker came up with this lovely phrase, raw data is an oxymoron. There's no such thing. All algorithms, all data carry the biases of the people and the cultures that collect and analyze and process and present that data. Here you see a piece of information design by Simon Scar for the South China Morning Post. And Scar has chosen a fairly obvious metaphor of dripping blood to talk about the heavy human cost of the Iraq conflict. I think this is a brilliant piece of information design. I love it. It's great work. It's laden with meaning, and its suggestion and connotation really leaps off the page. On the right-hand side, we see exactly the same raw data with an entirely different connotation. This is by Andy Cotgrave, who works at Tableau Software. And Cotgrave has completely transformed the meaning of exactly the same data with just 3 changes. He changes the color, the hue of that diagram, he has a new headline at the top, and he's flipped the chart on the vertical axis. I think this is elegant proof that even that same raw data, even with that, we can introduce biases simply through the way we structure, contextualize, and present the same information. Because really, for me, design is applied ethics. Now, sometimes that's a fairly obvious and explicit relationship. If you design razor wire, for example, whether you realize what you're doing or not, you're making a fairly powerful statement. You're saying that someone's right to private property and private land is so important that we should injure someone who chooses to contravene that right. But even if you're not making something as morally laden or morally explicit as razor wire or weapons or whatever it might be, all design and all making is really a statement about the future. When we design, we are putting a claim essentially into the world for how we should interact with technology in future, and then by extension, how we should interact with each other. And at the same time, we are discarding thousands of different futures. So there has to be a clear ethical component when design is really making a case for how we should all live. Now, in an ideal world, of course, we get to a point where ethics becomes an ethos. It becomes a way that we approach everything we do, how we take in the world around us and how we orientate ourselves toward that world. But as we saw at the start, I think the cause of ethics in the tech industry is we're coming from a fairly low start. So we have to find concrete steps where we can try to intervene, steps throughout the design process where we can start to take those ethical challenges more seriously. Forgive my oversimplification of the design process. Of course, we all know that it's rather messier than this. But right at the start, of a project, when we're defining the projects we take on, we're analyzing the markets that we build for, we can set ourselves a proper ethical foundation for our work. One of our biggest challenges here is to reconsider who we think of as a stakeholder for our work. Now, if you open up any business textbook, any MBA textbook, they will have a section on stakeholder analysis. But by this, they usually mean people who can affect the project, right? These are peers, colleagues, managers, executives, maybe they're regulators or partners, but generally, people a bit like us, people in suits and people in business. But there's a second group of stakeholders that we've overlooked for too long. This is people who can be affected by our projects. Airbnb is the example I often give here. Airbnb is a very well-designed service for precisely two groups of people. People who have spare property, and then people who want to rent some of that property. And according to sort of classic user-centered design theory, that's a very nice product. It works very nicely for those groups, for those cohorts. But all of the costs, all of the externalities, as we would call them, of that system fall not on those groups, but on local residents. If you live next door to an Airbnb, then you no longer have a neighbor. You have a new neighbor every couple of days. All of them dragging those wheelie suitcases over the cobbles at 5 a.m. They're not going to be interested in forming a local community. They're not going to spend their money at the local businesses. They'll spend them mostly in the tourist traps. They won't be interested in the norms and the culture of your particular block or your neighborhood. They will bring their own behaviors and biases. So we need to find a way to, not to discard the idea of user centricity, but to pair it with focus on a wider benefit for society and even the planet. I think user-centered design has made us narrow and individualistic. It's meant that we focus just on the needs of this user who may well, in modern society, is often a consumer, really just focusing on them in that transaction and ignoring the impacts on broader society and the environment and so on. So we have to find a way to protect these things. Perhaps we even go broader. If you work, for example, for Facebook, there is a reasonable claim that some of the work that's come out of your company has started to threaten or to tease apart the fabric of democracy or the freedom of the press. Maybe these are things we need to explicitly consider within the design process and find ways to protect. One way we might start to tease these things out is to use what I call a persona non grata. A persona non grata is essentially very similar to the personas that we all know and maybe or may not love. But it's a dark persona, a persona noir. It's maybe someone who wants to use the system for harm. They might be a troll or a terrorist or a hacker or whatever it is. But we can give them the full persona treatment. We can give them names and faces. But the most important thing is we expose their motivations, their goals. How do they want to use this system for harm? And then, of course, our job as designers and technologists becomes to stop these people, to hamper them in everything they want to do. It's sort of a weird inversion of the usual user-centered design process. But exposing them is, I think, an important step to trying to tackle that kind of problem. When we come to the ideation phase, when we're generating ideas, then we can build on that initial preparatory work and introduce a couple of new techniques. Now, I talked quite a bit at the start about unintended consequences, but I think it's helpful here to be precise. Just because we didn't intend a certain change, it doesn't mean that we couldn't have foreseen it. Unintended does not mean unforeseeable. There are actually methods, there are ways that we can use to try to tease out the second and third order implications of our work. Now, if you talk to an ethicist about this, ethicists sometimes talk about what they call moral imagination. The idea being you have to anticipate what might happen next and then imagine what the ethical impact, the moral impact of that would be. The difficulty is that's abstract, right? That's a thought experiment. It's hard to visualize. I think it's easier to do if you have some kind of prompt. The great thing here is, of course, we're designers. We're good at that kind of work. So I like to borrow from the field of speculative design, which if you haven't heard of yet, I'm confident you certainly will in the next few years. And I like to create what I call a provocatype. Now this really needs an example, so let me walk you through one. Here, this is by Marcel Schoenaar and Harm. It's a provocatype that they built for 2 Dutch energy clients. And essentially they built this large charging, electric vehicle charging station. It's, it's a good 2 meters tall. It's a very large piece of work. But it's answering the question or the brief of what might happen in a very likely scenario in 1 or 2 decades where we have electric vehicles and we also have scarcity of energy. We don't have enough energy to go around. How might we design a charging point, a public charging point, because it's unlikely that everyone's going to have their own, right? So there's going to have to be some public charging infrastructure. How would we design that in a world where there's not enough energy to go around? And so here's how it works. Right at the bottom, you'll see we've got some plugs. They actually took, the plugs off some electric vehicles and they included them. And, so you take these big things, you plug them in, and then some LEDs around it to say which color you are in the system. So, okay, I plugged in, I'm red, fine. Above that, you'll see we have some RFID readers. So I take my ID card and I tap it onto the charging point to authenticate myself with that system so it knows who I am. Above that, you'll see there are a couple of dials. So the point of these is I use these to request energy. Now, maybe I just need a short, 15-minute charge. I've got errands to do. Just give me a little bit and that's enough for the day. I can get on with things. Or maybe I need a full charge. In which case, I probably recognize I'm going to have to wait for that. So you use those dials to essentially make the request to the system. Then everything above is really what the algorithm has decided. It says, okay, well, you are going to get this amount of charge right now. You're going to get some later. So you see the panel there saying essentially how long until you're fully charged or when your slot starts. But above it, there's a visualization as well. There's sort of dot matrix thing at the top. And it starts at the bottom. So we've got red and blue currently have a little bit of charge each. Then finally blue gets all of it, and then green gets their turn at the end. So this is really the result of the algorithm. It's decided and processed these requests, and this is what it's come up with. So this provocatype starts to essentially expose what this algorithmically driven world might start to look like in a couple of decades. But the really interesting thing for me is the designers didn't stop there. They actually prototyped the ID cards as well, the ones we're using to tap to authenticate ourselves with the system. So these cards, they allocate social status as well as energy status. So in the middle, we might have a card given to a doctor. A doctor, let's say, maybe they have top priority in the system. They might need full charge for medical emergencies or whatever it is. But there's a threat, right? There's a caveat. You have to use this with discretion. If you abuse that power, then you might face repercussions for that. Underneath it, we have a probation ID. Maybe this is something we give to a recent offender or someone awaiting trial, and their energy use might be capped. Maybe they have the lowest priority within the system. Now, the designers aren't saying this is the best solution. They're not saying to their clients, you need to go and install a couple of hundred of these in Utrecht and Rotterdam. Instead, they've created a design that asks difficult questions and gets the right conversations happening, because this is full of ethical complexity, right? We could see if we design in this way, with the IoT and with energy scarcity coming together, then we could reinforce and cement social bias. So this artifact is that provocatype that exists really not as a design solution, but more as a research probe. It's kind of creating a wormhole between design and research. It's the design that gets the right ethical conversations happening. And really, for me, this is part of reframing how we think about ethics in our work. One of the challenges we have when we talk about ethics is people resist the idea. They think ethics is going to be a drag. Silicon Valley and the tech industry likes the idea of being innovative and fast-moving and agile and responsive. They see ethics sometimes as an obstruction to that it's going to hamper innovation. But I like the phrasing from Peter Paul Verbeek. He's a philosopher of technology. He's also in the Netherlands. And he says that ethics doesn't have to always oppose technology. It just has to go alongside it, accompany technological progress. So for me, the best way to do that is actually to think of ethics as a constraint. Now, we're all designers, right? So we know what constraints really mean. Most people who aren't designers, they think constraints mean you have fewer options. And to an extent that's true. Constraints will certainly eliminate some opportunities, but they create new ones as well. Ethics can be a seed of innovation. It can generate new ideas. It's not just about removing branches from the tree. It's about growing new ones. Ethics then can be a positive, a constructive force. When we come on to the design phase proper, whatever that is, really I think our focus here should be on challenging some of the preconceptions, things that we've taken for granted previously. So many of the ethical dangers of technology stem from invisibility, the fact that we've chosen to hide certain things. Most users don't know what's happening inside their devices, and I think designers, we should take some of the blame for that. We've had these mantras of simplicity for so long, and so that's meant that we've treated certain things like maybe data flows or algorithms as complexity. We've said, don't worry about those. You have no business really lifting the hood and tinkering and finding out what's happening. Don't worry, we've got it. So I think we need to flip that. Sometimes people say, well, what we need then is transparency to make these things clear. I actually think that's not the right framing, because obviously something that's transparent means you can't see it, you see through it. Instead, I think we materialize things that have previously been invisible. So we shift things like data flows or algorithmic persuasion. If we shift them into the visible spectrum, people can then make more informed choices about them. One of my favorite examples of this in modern technology is the energy monitor in the Prius. This is quite an old one. Obviously, this is, I think, from the 2003 model or something like that. But what I love about this is that it gives insight into a complex system that was previously completely hidden. Even in other hybrid vehicles, they didn't have this kind of display. So we see how energy, this invisible resource, is flowing through the car, the machine that I'm operating. And you can also then very easily learn the effect of your driving style on that. So you learn quickly, if I'm accelerating too sharply away from lights, then it's going to take energy from the engine rather than the battery. And so I can adjust how I drive to act in a more sustainable way. So by materializing, by making visible something that we'd previously hidden, that means people can act in more sustainable and ethical ways. So maybe we could apply a principle like this to other forms of digital tech, maybe the Internet of Things or home automation. So here's just a speculative design that I've done about some kind of home hub. These things are starting to emerge, right? They're connecting all your home automation, and maybe they're also reading information from your smart TV or from wearables, just to get a pattern of how you live your life. And let's say in this hypothetical world, maybe we get this device for free, but in exchange, some data is passed to advertisers, and so you see some ads on that device as part of that thing. Now, if we had a system like that today, it would be pretty much opaque. We wouldn't really know what data is moving between various points in that network. So maybe we can materialize that kind of statement. We can have this kind of data flow diagram that illustrates what's linked to what are the decisions taken, what data flows are happening at any one moment. And what I really like about this idea is, I think this gives the user power. It gives them agency in this system. If they see something they don't like, well, hang on, I don't think you deserve to have my heart rate, for example, then I think we can easily go in and say, well, we can just swipe that off and remove it, and then that breaks that connection. So something like this, where we're materializing something that's always been hidden, I think that brings us far closer to proper, informed, and ethical consent, and a fair exchange. I know what I'm giving up, but I also know what I'm getting in return, and I think that's a reasonable thing to request. Unfortunately, that's still rather a long way off in a lot of the technologies we build today. Another design tenet that we often hear is this idea of "don't make me think." As we all know, that's the title of Steve Krug's bestseller. And of course, this is generally true, right? This is usually a good idea to minimize friction in our interfaces, but at times that causes us to take power and agency away from the user. So just sometimes, I think this is a principle that we need to invert. Sometimes we should make the user think. Sometimes we should increase the friction in our interfaces. Let's say we have a consent dialog box for that same home hub, that same IoT system. Well, it's asking for pretty highly sensitive things. It's asking for my location, so it knows where I live. Maybe it's asking for my biometrics, my heart rate, whatever else it might have. I think people need to be very clear that they know what they're doing when they say yes. Now, classical usability theory would probably say, well, you make a nice big green button, right? Fitz's law, you make it as large as you can. You might have a small cancel link, but something easy and tappable, and you move on. But I'm saying here, maybe this is something where we need to alert the user to the risks. Any data that's anonymized, there's always a risk that it might be unanonymized, re-identified later on, if you have better data or better algorithms to combine it with. So the user needs to know that risk. They need to know what they're entering into. And I'm going to make you write with your finger or a stylus the words I agree to carry on with that exchange. Now, if I try and get this, shipped, if I talk to my colleagues, my peers, they'll certainly point out this is going to convert a lot less well, right? We're going to have fewer people agreeing to this exchange of data than if I just put a nice big green button. And that's true. But as I say, like the previous example, this builds proper, genuine, true consent with that knowledge of the exchange of value that's happening. And so I think that builds trust. I think it reduces the risk that people will reject it later, will be unhappy with the decisions that we force them to take. It might even reduce the risk of lawsuits or punitive regulation. Another design principle that we can apply at this stage is something called the veil of ignorance. This comes from a philosopher called John Rawls. He wrote a book called Theory of Justice. And the idea of a veil of ignorance is quite a simple one. Essentially, it's that any fair system is one designed as if we don't know where we'll end up in that system. So let's say I'm designing a welfare program. If I use this veil of ignorance, I should design that so that wherever I end up, whether I'm a taxpayer, whether I'm an administrator, whether I'm a recipient of these systems, wherever I end up in that system, I should feel like I've got a fair deal. So this is really agreeing the rules of the game before we deal out the hands. It's about stepping into the shoes of each of those stakeholder groups that I talked about earlier, the people who can affect the project, but also the people who the project affects, and seeing, well, how do they see it, and making sure that those views are represented, particularly when we come to design critique. And speaking of which, I think design critique is probably one of the most important phases in this ethical journey. It's probably the easiest place to start having these conversations, because critique is all about questioning whether we've done the right thing. Is the solution we've got appropriate for the problem? And here we can draw upon hundreds of years of ethical thought. One idea that I came across more recently, which I really like, is something called a designated dissenter. This is an idea I read about in Sarah Wachter and Eric Meyer's book, Design for Real Life. And the designated dissenter is really a role of antagonism, but constructive antagonism. It's someone who role plays as someone who has problems with the team's assumptions. So they're there to lob in these little grenades of defiance into that process. So maybe we're designing a form or something simple. Maybe it's asking for marital status. Well, if you're a designated dissenter, maybe you role play as someone going through a messy divorce, and you say, well, why are you asking me for this information? I don't want to have to think about these things. Also, at this stage, there are some very useful questions we can ask just to start those ethical discussions flowing, taking us really beyond the hunches that we have. I think one of the difficulties when talking about ethics is we all have some intuitive sense, some moral intuition of what's wrong and what's right. But we need a more rigorous way to talk about these things. We need to be able to evaluate ethics more fairly. So we can apply what I would call the 4 ethical tests. And these I've derived from the 3 main schools of ethics. So let's go through them. Test number 1. What if everyone did what I'm about to do? Would a world in which this action was a universal law, would that be a better place or a worse place? Now, this is an idea that goes back all the way to Immanuel Kant, and it's what's known as a deontological theory. of ethics. If you're a deontologist, if you believe in this particular perspective on ethics, then generally you believe that there are certain ethical rules to follow. You believe that you have a duty, a moral obligation to behave in a certain way. So let's look at this for, say, a dark pattern. If I have someone on my team, and I'm hesitant to throw product managers under a bus, but it's going to be a product manager, who says, I want you to put this dark pattern in an interface. Let's say I've got a subscription product, and they want me to toggle it to auto-renew rather than to run out after the trial and have to get the credit card information then. Well, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? If I think that that's an intentional dark pattern designed to trick our users, well, it's pretty obvious what would happen if everyone did that. If everyone shipped every dark pattern that they could or that they were asked to do, well, of course, the sphere of technology is diminished. We start to trust our devices less, our technologies less. So this gives me some ammunition. I can go back to the business and say, I actually don't think that's a direction that we should be taking. Second test that we might offer. Am I treating people as ends or as means? Now this might take a little bit of unpacking. This also comes from Immanuel Kant. In the world of design, really for me this is almost always about users. How are we treating them? Are we treating them as free individuals with their own goals and motivations? Or am I really treating them as ways for me to hit my own targets, my own goals? Now, I don't think that's a question that any individual designer should struggle with. I think we all believe very much in the idea of the user as someone with, important goals that we should try to support. But I do think it's a question that larger and data-driven companies in particular maybe start to get wrong. Because a lot of the time in these companies, the way we think about users shifts slowly with time. They become not the reason that we're there, but they become experimental subjects. They become means for us to achieve our own goals, to hit our own targets. Essentially, sometimes people become masses. And whenever that happens, whenever we start to see people as a mass rather than as a collection of individuals, unethical design is almost always just around the corner. Third ethical test we can offer, am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And by extension, am I minimizing suffering, minimizing pain for as many people as I can? This is what's known as a utilitarian perspective on ethics. And utilitarians don't really care about duty and laws and obligation like a deontologist would. They care about results, they care about consequences and impact. And I think to a lot of people in the tech industry, this feels promising because it feels like it might be measurable, right? There might be a way to quantify this. And there are people, there's a whole emerging field of what's called scientific morality, of people who try to get calculable answers to this. They put people in MRI scanners, they do the skin response thing, they check their heart rates and they look at NPS scores and all that sort of stuff, and their aim is to try and end up with some equation, essentially, for morality, where we know that this will be the result, therefore we think we should do this. Of course, I think there are some challenges with that perspective as well. Isn't this just going to turn us into number crunchers? Are we really going to have to do this for every single decision we take? But nevertheless, I think this is a useful concept when we're starting to understand the impacts of our decisions on a wide range of people, not just this narrow perspective of the user. And then the fourth ethical test, would I be happy for this to be a front page story? So this question is grounded in this third school of ethics, which is called virtue ethics. And virtue ethicists, they don't really care about rules and duty like the deontologists do, and they don't really care about the impacts, the outcomes, like a utilitarian would. Instead, they care about our moral character, our individual motivations. Essentially, this is a question about accountability, right? Would I sign my name to the decisions that I'm about to take? So a virtue ethicist will ask us to decide what are the values, the virtues that we want to live by as individuals. And then will ask us to be sure that we're taking decisions that make those virtues clear, that evidence those virtues. So it speaks very much to our identity, it speaks to who we are as individuals. And so that, I think, can be an important part of ethical reasoning. Now again, there might be a downside to this. If I'm only doing something because I'm going to be embarrassed that people would find out if I do the other thing, that doesn't feel like proper moral choice, right? That if I'm Immanuel Kant, then I'm certainly going to object to that kind of behavior. Anyway, each of these tests we can drop in, particularly at the critique phase, to start these conversations happening and to elevate us from that moral intuition where we all have a hunch of whether we think something's right or wrong. These offer us a way to start to grapple with those in a more rigorous manner. And then, of course, we need to spend time testing whether our assumptions were correct. Have we actually created the impacts that we thought we were going to? And so we can take measures to analyze our systems on a mathematical basis, a quantitative basis, particularly things like machine learning systems. We can analyze their data sets, look at those for bias. We can audit an algorithm to see whether it's creating fair outputs. This is something that Kate Crawford, who's a Microsoft research employee and partner in the AI Now Foundation. She calls this fairness forensics. It's a really nice phrase, I think, for analyzing quantitatively the inputs and outputs of these systems. But we all know, of course, that any quantitative technique tends to be better if you have a qualitative technique alongside. So, of course, research has a role to play here as well. We need to understand better the effects of our decisions on a wider range of people. We talk about this idea of the designated dissenter. Well, who better to be a designated dissenter than someone who has every cause to dissent? So for me, this is about increasing our understanding of a wider group of individuals, testing our provocatypes, our betas, our products with them, and doing that early before these technologies go live, and of course then all the potential harms of those technologies go into the world. Sadly, because of the way I mentioned before that humans and technology sort of coexist, the harms of technology most often fall upon the people who are already the most vulnerable in our world. So we have to understand these people better. We have to appreciate these communities more. So I think we need to bring their representatives or their activists into the design process, into our studios, into our companies, to better understand what they need from a system and how we might harm them if we make the wrong decisions. And then underpinning all of this, we need to create what I would call ethical infrastructure, some means of improving our resilience and our, if you like, a natural sort of predisposition to get these decisions right. I think building a diverse team is a really important part of it. Now, diversity is sometimes seen as a political issue, and I make no apologies for bringing it up here. I think a diverse team is really an early warning system for ethics, because you have people who understand the broader needs of a wider range of communities. They can introduce those ideas, or they can introduce those warnings into the design team, into the product team earlier, so that we don't make those mistakes with a live product. So hiring for people with inherent diversity and acquired diversity, and the interplay between those, I think, helps to build some sort of vaccination, some inoculation against some of these ethical mistakes. If you're lucky enough to run a team, to be a leader in your organization, then you also have an opportunity to make it clear what's expected, to set expectations, and then to reward the right behaviors. This is really about making it clear that ethics should be part of everyone's job. It's not just someone, some one person who makes those decisions. These are inherent in all the decisions that we take. My old boss at Twitter, Mike Davidson, used to have a saying, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he says something like, if you just reward the results, then you get all sorts of behaviors. But if you reward the right behaviors, you usually get the right results as well. So we might say, do this through career ladders, explain, well, here's the behavior I expect from a designer level 1 right through to a vice president, making it clear that this is really a problem that rests upon all of us. And then we might try to codify this sort of stuff. We might look at something like core values to say, how do we as an organization have some proper collection, if you like, of how we should take these tricky ethical decisions. Now, core values, I think, get a lot of stick, right? A lot of people don't like them. And there are companies that really just pay lip service, that come up with some bad core values and then never really look at them again. But I think when core values are properly well-defined and they're truly adopted by the organization, they become really good tiebreakers of ethical challenges. These are things we can fall back on and say, well, as an organization, right from the top, we've agreed that whenever we face a challenge, we will act in these certain ways. And what can that then tell us about the decision that we're about to take? Now, of course, some of this takes us into the realm of politics. And I think tech workers are finally starting to wake up to their collective power. If you look particularly at Google, they've had mass employee rebellion over Project Maven, which is basically a drone targeting project they were doing for the Pentagon. They've had the Google walkout. We're now seeing Amazon employees collectivize around climate change. Individually, we're quite weak, I think, as workers, but collectively, we're quite strong. Tech employees are fairly expensive, we're hard to replace, and of course if we lift our hands off the devices, nothing gets built. The tech industry is now getting targeted on both wings, particularly in the US and in the EU. And so that pressure, I think, is going to increase. There's going to be more regulation, there's going to be more politics involved in our work. So I think the best way to respond to that is to get involved in that process, to help shape that future. We may be skeptical, some of us, about the idea of more regulation on what we do. But even the most pedantic bureaucrat, no one wants bad regulation. So we have to help get involved to make sure that any regulation that does come our way, and it certainly will, try to make sure that it's as good a set of rules as we can create. But ultimately, it's really all down to practice. Morality is a muscle. It needs exercise. It's not something that's just bestowed. It's not some gift that just a few people have. The choice to live well is just that. It is a choice. So this means asking ourselves uncomfortable and difficult questions. How might I be screwing up right now in the work that I'm doing? What might my limit be? What would be a question or a request that crosses my moral line? And how would I start to have those conversations? How would I talk to my manager, to my team, to my peers about why I think that's wrong? Of course, there is an important role to play in looking at the overall system and how can we make that fairer. But it's also an individual choice as well. Sometimes we have to choose to stand up for what is right. Now, of course, that can be risky. That requires some privilege. Not everyone has the comfort and safety required to put their hand up and say, I don't think we should do this any longer. But I will say this, if you feel comfortable and safe and respected in your role, in your company, in your career, then you're in the ideal position to use up just a little bit of that goodwill to push for that kind of ethical change. However, you do have to take care of yourself along the way. Focusing on ethics can be difficult and punishing work. It can be easy to criticize yourself for your own ethical mistakes and inconsistencies just as much as it is to focus on those around you. But the good news, and what I really choose to cling to throughout all of this, is that if you focus on trying to prioritize ethical decisions, I think that brings you closer to being the kind of person that you really want to be. But given how emotionally draining that work can be, it does mean that we also have to rely upon each other. And given the challenges of the future, we're going to need all of the thoughtful technologists and designers that we can get, people who care enough to make a difference in this terrifically important industry of ours and want to help navigate it toward better futures. It goes without saying that I dearly hope that you will choose to be one of those people. Thanks for your time. Thank you
for your talk. We have a time for a few questions. Here you go.
First of all, thanks a lot for coming and for the amazing talk. My question is regarding the prototypes, which is a fascinating idea overall. How do you, what's the basis essentially for the prototype? Because it seems like process-wise, you might not have enough input or some sort of structure in place to base your assumptions on, and therefore you're just guessing essentially, which means biases and just putting something that you think might work.
I think that's pretty much what it is. Yeah, you're definitely right. There may not be space in the existing design processes that we hold dear. That we know the process orthodoxies of Agile and Lean and Kanban or whatever we're running this particular week, and so there is a case of we have to just try something. So it's about creating the space to try and do that within your process, protecting that space to say, well, first, we need to just explore this, right? It's almost, the double diamond, which we're all familiar with, yes. The double diamond. This is really a first diamond activity, right? This isn't a delivery phase activity. This is when we're discovering what the real problem is. And that's where we can uncover those real ethical challenges. But you are right that any stab we take will come with its own biases, assumptions, mistakes, but that's why we do them, right? This is why we get them into the open and say, well, if it were something like this, what happens? What ideas does it introduce? Does it uncover that we previously would have had no idea of until we've delivered a product? So we have to ring fence some kind of time. I mean, it's still very emergent. This whole field of speculative design is fascinating, but it's still mostly ending up in art galleries rather than real design studios. It's one thing I'm desperate to change, which is why I'm trying to evangelize the idea here. Yeah. I don't know how you would find it best fits into your process, but really it's in that kind of definition phase, I think, rather than trying to shoehorn it into an agile delivery flow. That's just never going to work.
It almost feels like it comes full circle, and diversity is essential in this case.
I agree. Ideally, diversity within your project team or the people creating this stuff, but also then diversity in the number of people exposed to this. So I think the provocatype and this idea of creating these speculative objects, it's not just about saying, okay, team, what do we think about this? It should be something we should introduce to our wider stakeholders, to our public, to our potential users, and say, we don't yet know what this is going to be, but if we did something like this, what might happen? Now, you have to manage the communications around that. You have to manage the PR. Google had this whole X project, the Selfish Ledger, which essentially was leaked. And the press saw it and went, oh my God, Google are planning some terrifying stuff. And they had to manage that comms message and say, this looks scary because that's the point, right? This is why we're doing it. So if we did something, wow, that's pretty far out. What might that mean? So you've got to manage that quite tightly. But I think it can be done. Companies are starting to get better at tightening that message, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we had one at the back here.
Over here, thanks.
For the topic everyone forgot about. As we know, nothing in this world comes for free. And I have two questions following. In designing a product or something, is it really reasonable to foresee all the possible consequences? How am I say that? Is it really reasonable to foresee all the consequences on not just the most obvious one and fix the problems upon they appear?
Okay.
The post factum.
Okay. Well, let's do that one, and then you said I had a second one, so I'll answer that one first. No, you won't get them all. Definitely, you won't get them all, but we should try at least, because to be honest, the industry hasn't bothered looking at any of the potential consequences. They've had this mindset, this move fast and break things, this idea that essentially we can't possibly predict what might happen, so we'll make it and see, and we'll iterate upon that. The problem with that, of course, is it means the real harms are falling upon real people, and then we're trying to fix those later. It's about trying some steps to identify the largest threats, the largest ethical risks, and then try and mitigate those. It's kind of the same as usability testing. You know, you will run it with your, a couple of rounds of 6 users each, and you'll get hopefully the big ones. There will still be some smaller ones, but at least you've tried. It's not reasonable to expect that we'll anticipate them all because, the law of unintended consequences, you can never predict everything. There will always be unintended uses. The product just flies off in a totally unanticipated direction with a group of people who twist it for their own purposes. And that's great. We want that kind of thing. But it's just taking some steps to identify the biggest threats and then to handle those for sure. Yeah.
Thanks. That's clear.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you'll have a chance to catch Cennydd later on the breaks, on the lunch. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.